So the first thing that we'll do building this character's hand is kind of something that we did with the arm, and that is to look at the fingers and realize that there's a bunch of cylinders. And so what we can do is start to create the fingers themselves. Now sometimes people will create the hands from the hand outward. We're going to go ahead and create the hands from the fingers and fill in the geometry in here so we can have more control over the shape of the fingers and get that down. So we created our cylinder. Let's go ahead and bring it up into position here and just temporarily kind of rotate it a little bit just so that we can get the right kind of length. Now for the resolution going around the finger, again, we want it to be nice and round when we smooth it, but we don't necessarily need 8. I think we can go a couple of subdivisions lower than that so that we can have kind of the minimum amount, because you think about this, you're going to have all the resolution for this finger, and you're going to have that four more times, so 5 total, all flowing into the same object. And so we're already going to have to reduce the geometry if we want to connect it up to the arm. And so we can make that a little bit easier by creating a lower resolution finger. So if you want to add more detail, you can add more resolution, but I'm going to go ahead and change this down to 6. So it's fairly low resolution, and you probably don't want to go too much lower than that. Let's go ahead and change our height. So I'll increase that height amount, and just so we get something that's kind of close to what we want. It doesn't have to be exact. So looking at maybe 15 or so in the height. You can see that matches up fairly well here. And so I'm going to go ahead, just because it's a little bit easier to build these things along the axis, I'm going to go ahead and take off the rotation. And let's actually rotate this down. I'm going to make it flat, so let's actually zero that to 90. Okay. And let's go ahead and zero this out as well. Okay, so now we're dealing with just one finger here. Let me go ahead and read that up. There we go. So now again, we need to start to add divisions here and start to add some shape to this guy. So we've got the subdivisions set for around the axis. What we need to do now is set subdivisions along the length, because take a look at your finger. You've got the knuckle where it connects up with the hand, and then you've got 2 more joints coming out to the tip of the finger. So you can see we've got a little section that we need to create out here, and then we've got another division that we need to create here. And not to mention the divisions that we'll need to actually set the shape of our finger. So let's go ahead in the subdivisions along the height. Let's set that up, and here is the kind of the minimum. So you've got 1, 2, 3 sections before it hits the knuckle. But let's go ahead and add a couple more. So if we add that, that gives us joints here and here, and then we also have geometry between those joints to modify the shape and add a little bit of shape to it. We're probably going to need to create a little bit more geometry on the end, but we'll do that as we need to. Okay, so let's go ahead and start to shape this. So the first thing that I'm going to do is go ahead and delete the back end of this. That's where it's going to connect up to the hand. I'm going to take this and I'm just going to increase that a little bit, the size, and move it down. Okay, this is going to be our joint. Let's go ahead and decrease that a little bit. Let's take the bottom of this, pull it down. We'll do the same thing here. Let's do the same thing here. Okay. Now I want to move these joints a little bit, so I'm going to take the joints and move them a little bit closer to the end of the finger. Okay. Now I want to flatten off the top of this finger a little bit. So I'll go ahead and pull that top down just a little. Let's take this geometry and just kind of pull it back a little bit. We'll take the corners of it and kind of pull those back. Let's add another little bit of resolution here. We could do that going to Edit Mesh, Insert Edge Loop Tool. We'll go ahead and insert an edge loop here, and then we can take that entire end and just kind of pull it down a little bit. Okay, let's take the end here pull this down a little bit. Just add a little bit of shape to our finger here. And depending on what the size you want the end of the finger to be. And we can come in here and let's just add a little bit of shape from the top. So I'll enlarge the end of our finger just a little bit. It's going to be a little bit more stylized. Let's do the same thing in here and here. And anytime you can go ahead and smooth this out and actually see what it's going to look like. It doesn't look like much right now. Let's go ahead and increase this. So we want to kind of taper it down as it goes. So let's increase this and this and then this end so that it tapers down a little bit more. We also want to really get a sense of that division where these joints are. And so let's go ahead and use the offset edge loop one more time. And this time we'll just grab the edge loop itself, dial that in. We'll do the same thing on this joint. So again, just as we did with the elbow, we want to have resolution there. It not only helps with deformation, but it also gives us a little bit of detail to be able to add to the shape. So we'll take this here, kind of move it down a little bit. Let's do the same thing with this one. So this will give us a nice little crease here when we smooth it. We should probably stop and talk a little bit more about smoothing here. So what's happening is it's creating a smooth version of this between these points. So it's smoothing between this point. So for instance, along this direction, smoothing between this point, and then it's smoothing between this point and this point and this point. Okay, so you can imagine the smoothing that happens between these 3 points, which are very far apart, is going to be nice and smooth. The interpolation that happens between points that are very close together, you're going to start to get things like this, where you get a nice little crease in here. So these are things to be avoided in some cases, but in some cases they're going to be necessary for the look that you actually want. Okay, let's go ahead and bring this down a little bit more. Let's bring the end of this finger in a little bit. We can start to bring the top of those knuckles up a hair. Maybe add a little bit of shape to the fingers. Okay, bring that in. Now if you want to create kind of an indication of sort of a fingernail, what we can do is select those faces on top, either in the smooth view or not, and then we can go ahead and do an extrude. And let's just extrude those in. And then we can come in here, take this and push it down. And then this and push it up. If you want to create separate geometry for that, you can do that too. You have to pay attention to the style of the character that it is that you're creating. And you can get kind of a little bit of an indication of a fingernail. And if you need to if it's kind of flattening out too far to the side, you can kind of bring some of that geometry back in. And pull that out a little bit more. And just add a little bit of shape to it that way. Okay, let's go ahead and pull the end of that finger down. Let's pull the end of this one down a little bit and start to add a little bit of shape to our finger. Okay, so we can now come in and we can start to take this finger and maybe move it up into position and just get the length the way that we want it, if you want to do that. But in the next lesson, we'll go ahead and take this initial finger and start to build our hand. So before we do that, let's actually kind of look at the layout for this. So if this is the middle finger, we imagine kind of a relaxed finger here. So let's go ahead and I'm just going to rotate this down just a little bit. Again, we want to add a little bit of that bend to it. So I'm going to go ahead and move using insert. I'm going to move that pivot, and then I can sort of rotate it down just a little bit, not much. And then let's go ahead and duplicate this. I'll move it off to this side, okay, and I'm going to rotate it just a little bit. I'm also going to scale it down a little bit, okay, and I want to rotate it up just a little. So something like that. Let's do the same thing here. We'll duplicate this over to this side. And depending on the kind of finger that you have, you can make this a little bit smaller than your middle finger there. Okay. I also want to kind of move this into sort of an arc shape. You can go ahead and make this a little bit shorter. Let's do it one more time. And this time we'll make our little finger. So just kind of scaling this. We'll rotate it out a little bit more. Push it back from the top view. And I want to take both of these and I want to rotate them down a little bit. And this as well. I also want to kind of move them down. So if this is the highest point, kind of pull this one down a little bit. Okay, so something like that. And you can modify the shape of those if you want to. If they're a little bit too squared off for your taste, you can kind of pull that out a little bit. They don't have to all be exactly the same, but build them together helps us to reuse that geometry so we don't have to build everything all at once. Now we also need the thumb, so we can go ahead and duplicate this finger. Let's go ahead and bring it over here. And instead of putting this sort of on the same plane, what we want to do is rotate it down. But if you look at your thumb, that the last joint, or the second joint, is going to be kind of buried in your hand. And so what we want to do is just delete one of these joints. So let's go ahead and I can get rid of this geometry here. And then I can go ahead and scale that up a bit. Okay, take all this and kind of scale it up a little. Make it maybe a little bit beefier. We kind of rotate this down a little. Okay, and now let's go ahead and position this. Now it's not going to be positioned flat like this. We're going to go ahead and rotate it down, and also kind of rotate it to the side. And let's actually move it down. In this case, I actually do want to move it in the world axis, so let's go ahead and move it down in the Y. Okay, move it over more towards the hand. Kind of scale it up a little bit. And so we want it to be kind of back along where the hand will be. So kind of something like that. I mean, if you don't want it quite that far down. Okay, so you start to get the idea of where that hand will actually be. So once we've got our fingers built, let's go ahead in the next lesson and start to combine these fingers together to create the hand base. So we'll go ahead and do that next.